Well, thank you so much for watching Morning Live, and I can tell you the conversation has already started, and yeah, some of us already getting quite excited over this because South African consumers who use banking services are still not safe from fraudulent deductions that go through their accounts. Now, these rogue operators also depend on the fact that some clients don't actually check their bank statements, and numerous people have been affected by those recurring 99 Rand deductions. And experts say that banks are trying their best to address these scams by implementing various measures, but that they are failing to take full responsibility. However, there are always new scams, and I'm sure you can see those on your account. And in addition, last year, digital banking fraud was said to be at its highest level in South Africa. So to discuss this further, we're joined now by Enoch Malisa, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the Payments Association of South Africa, or PASA, and Precious Ncayiyana, who is the Stakeholder Relations Director at Consumer Fair. Thanks so much to both of you for coming through.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Now, this is one that hits home for many of us, where you see these transactions that you have absolutely no knowledge of going off on your account, and it almost feels as a futile effort going back to your bank every month asking them to reverse it. But before we even get into the actual details of this, if I could just ask you, Enoch, as the Payments Association of South Africa, PASA, what exactly does your organization do?
Our organization operates from the remit that comes from the Reserve Bank, and we regulate all nature of payments in the country. So it will be from your consumer payments into your retail and corporate payments.
So when you say you regulate, what exactly do you regulate and how?
So we work with the regulators, in this case, the Reserve Bank and all the other sister regulators from that end, and we also work with the banks in terms of coming up with the rules that govern payment transactions, that govern dispute of transactions, that also govern how we penalize people that are not adhering to the respective requirements of processing of transactions.
Great. So absolutely the right person to answer as to why we keep having these recurring debit orders going off on our accounts when we haven't authorized any of these payments. How does that actually happen? So
historically, the debit order system was built for a handful of companies, and those were blue chip companies. With the growth of financial inclusion, a number of other companies started, coming through. So that's the one part. The second part is, let's just walk through very quickly a customer who goes into, let's say, MTN as an example. You sign a contract. At the bottom there, you sign also a debit order to say they can debit your account on this day for X amount. That piece of paper sits with MTN in this regard. Now, if you bank with, pick a bank, call it ABSA, call it Standard Bank. Your bank, being ABSA, does not have that piece of paper because you've signed it and you've left it with your service provider. So there's a whole lot of these mandates that are sitting with service providers that the banks don't have. But the system was not necessarily built that the bank has the mandate. It was built that the transaction, when it comes through from your service provider, the bank will just check whether you have the amount in your account and debit accordingly. Now, we've realized the deficiencies because the fraudsters have utilized this opportunity to say, because the bank does not have the mandate, they then inject fraudulent transactions. And the banks would not necessarily check them because there's nothing to check against. The mandate is sitting elsewhere. So we've come together through the assistance of the Reserve Bank, most of the banks in SA, with a product called Debit Check, which is now in operation. What does it do? It moves the mandate that we've left with MTN, it brings it to the bank. So the bank will then be able to check that mandate and then approve the transaction. If that mandate doesn't sit with the bank, the transaction will not be approved. So that's strategy number one. Strategy number two, because we're dealing here with over 80 million, debit orders that are flowing through into consumer accounts. Strategy number two is then to try and identify who these companies are, because you find that this is a system that has worked. It's a system that still works. And only a few companies that are defrauding the system and then, turning it on its head as though it doesn't work. How do we then identify these companies? We've worked with SABC, we're working with CPRO, we've identified companies. And if I can just fast track, Sakina, just last week or the other week, 2 banks in South Africa, FNB and ABSA, have come up very openly to say we've identified these companies, 2 companies in particular. It's a Procol and Mzansi, reference on your account. They say customers that have these debit orders, don't hesitate. And the instruction that they've given to us as PASA is to say, don't even follow the normal channels of disputing anything that comes from the other banks. Send those transactions directly to us. So as the banking community, we're getting closer to closing the net, if I can naturally, use that term. But because it's something that is speaking to volumes of transactions, it will take us time to turn the corner. There is indeed significant strides that have been taken. The last one, if I may just add, some of these challenges don't come from the fraudsters. Some of these challenges come from us as consumers, because of cash management. I run out of cash, I go to the bank, I reverse the debit order. So when you look in the system, all the reversed debit orders, it's a mixture of half and half. What comes from the fraudsters and also what is reversed by customers where there's naturally a mandate behind.
But I get a sense that the banks are perhaps making more of that than they ought to be, instead of dealing with the problem of these illegal debit orders, because it's not a new problem by any means. And again, it almost sounds, and I'm listening very closely to what you are saying to me, Mr. Malisa, it sounds as though the banks have taken on more than they can actually deal with, as you say, the amount of debit orders that they have to deal with, and then they've become derelict in their duty. Because if I haven't authorized that transaction, what gives the bank the right to actually take my money and pay someone with it? And I want to bring a Precious in here. What are my rights as a consumer when the banks do this type of thing?
I mean, the way this has happened, it takes away the rights from us because it makes us helpless. It's like the deduction is not that high for you to go further than dealing with your bank, like going to ombudsman or going to court. You see, these companies are very clever in how they deduct. They take smaller amounts so that though you are frustrated, but it doesn't, you cannot take legal steps against them. And what has been the most problem, it's been happening for years, and you would find that one company has had thousands and thousands of transactions, and the banks have kept that information with them, has not passed it on to the authorities, because that is a crime. I mean, you could not have people collecting so much money, making or ruining other people's credits, and then they are not being brought to order or charged, or the banks are still feel that they have an obligation to correct what they've done. If anybody has suffered losses because of that, they need to come into play, because if it had happened initially, initial stages are fine, but it has been a trend, and they never did anything up until now, 2019, late 2018, 2019, to come up with debit check. And the debit check has yet to be seen in practice. You know, even now, like you were alluding to say there must be an unauthorized debit order going off somewhere.
Indeed. But what does the Consumer Protection Act say about this type of thing?
Like he explained how the banking process, how the debit order system is like that, to say they would do it. But initially it was for the blue chip companies, like he said, because those were, you have to, as a company, you have to protect your brand. You know, you're setting, if you're doing with a particular big company, you know, you trust it, and it's in your best interest to protect that image. Whereas for SMEs, some of them, you can't even call them SMEs. I think they're just there to take advantage of this. So then they started doing this. But when they allow SMEs to also be part of the debit order system, it was to help them, because debit orders are a safe, cheap and convenient way of collecting money and to boost cash flows. You know, you have a particular clientele that is guaranteed to bring you some income every month. And then even for consumers, it's convenience, because you don't want to be going every month, you know, having to pay everyone that you have to pay. So from that perspective, debit orders were good for everybody up until then they were open to such these smaller companies that came with fraudulent practices. But the banks also, because they are benefiting, if your order is rejected, you get charged a penalty and then a fee and then a rejection fee and interest on top of that, and it ruins your credit if it happens more often.
Which is exactly what I wanted to ask Enoch Malisa next about the charges.
Yes.
So why should the consumer be saddled with any charges for a transaction that has gone off on their account that they have not authorized?
So Kene, if you'd allow me, I'll answer that question, but I just want to go back to your earlier comment with regards to the banks being derelict. I think it goes back to the statement I'd made earlier to say the mandate had not been sitting with the bank. So the bank had nothing to check against in order to then protect you. So how the systems were designed before were actually just allowing flow through traffic, and were changing that.
So the systems were deficient.
The system, we can term it now and say they were deficient in terms of saying the bank just processes without checking.
Yeah, but the bank needs to take responsibility. Banks are super citizens in this country.
Yes.
They can do no wrong.
No, I'm not defending them.
They need to take responsibility for
correct.
that.
I'm not defending them in that regard, because we take collective responsibility as an industry that's looking after consumers from a payments point of view. The other question that you ask is with regards to the fees. Now, our mandate from a payments association point of view is we deal with the rules and not necessarily the pricing. Now, I would have loved probably if we have either my colleague here or somebody even from banking association where they are an advocacy group that speaks to the pricing related issues. Now, our mandate does not allow us to speak to pricing. However, we are also concerned as PASA that for such a scourge, where it's proven customers should not be charged. But again, it's not our mandate to tell the banks what to do insofar as the pricing is concerned.
And Precious, again, from a consumer perspective, something that Enoch Malisa mentioned earlier, if you as a consumer keep going back to reverse these debit orders, does that have any sort of impact on your credit profile?
Yes, most definitely, because then when somebody's checking your credit online, they see you with all these reverse debit orders, because it means like, okay, I qualify, somebody gives you, in good faith because they know you can afford, but then you're not going to make payments, because on the history, it doesn't say that you disputed this because it was illegally or it was unauthorized. So on the history, it doesn't say it was unauthorized. It just it comes up as a reverse order, and it's happening more frequently. So for some, it's very bad. And then for some companies, one thing I've noticed, some consumers are cash strapped already. They will go to a financial service provider, maybe not the big ones, the smaller ones, to apply for a loan. So what do you do when you apply for a loan? So they're going to ask for your details, your ID number, your banking detail, which bank, and so forth. You provide that because it's in line with you applying for a loan. But sometimes what happens is the same people you are applying for a loan for, they don't give you a loan, but they start debiting your account. And if you didn't have money, and then it's escalating, the negative effect on your credit.
You see, I always thought that, my $1 million signature was worth something in terms of transacting, and that without it, nobody would actually have access to my bank account, for example, but evidently not. So what word of advice do you have for consumers? How can we protect ourselves? So let's start with you, Enoch Malisa.
So, and I think it's important that we emphasize that there's quite a lot of companies who call us. Number one, you would not know where they got your cell phone number from. So they will call you and offer you a number of, products. And sometimes consumers are duped to then even give banking details, and they're told that, no, we will not debit your account, but that information is critical. You've given to somebody and you don't know where it's going to end up. And in many cases, that's how the fraudsters then get your banking account, where you bank, and they start debiting you. And obviously, they will then test the system. Sometimes they change the account name from this to the other. So I would also say to consumers, because we also have multiple cell phones, the bank no longer has the true record of how do they contact you. So much as we're saying the banks must be accountable, But the banks must also be able to contact the consumers. So make sure that the bank has got your active cell phone number. And where banks offer SMS services for transactions that are happening in your accounts, also activate that, because it gives you early warning.
But
on
what is
anything
Speak
that
Up for?
happens.
Don't we go and verify that this is me, this is my account?
Sakina, the point I'm making is, we know that we've got a number of SIM cards, but we've got one handset. And we interchange these SIM cards, and the bank does not have all the other SIM cards, they only have one number. So where do they contact you? That's the point I'm trying to make. They have figured you on your original number you've given. But as you change SIM cards, you don't go back to the bank and then give them your current number. That's the point I'm making.
30 seconds, Precious.
Yeah, I mean, protecting your information is still very important, and unfortunately, people have to check their bank statements on a monthly basis, because you have 40 days to actually dispute, any debit order, and beyond that, then you need a court order. But I think at the banks, they still have to do more to protect us, because I mean, like, we don't have time nor the money to be looking after 99 rands every month.
Thank you so much to our guest this morning, Chief Operating Officer of the Payments Association of South Africa, or PASA, and also from the Consumer Fair. We had Precious Ncayiyana, and from PASA, our guest this morning, Mr. Enoch Malisa. And we're going to leave it there. If you want to get in touch, at Morning Live SABC. Let's take a break.